Welcome everyone today. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Harry Quilterpinner. I'm Director of Research and Engagement at IPPR. And we are here today to talk about technology, democracy, trust, creating a more democratic online world. So a big and interesting topic for us to kick off. And I'm going to set us a kind of lofty ambition for today's conversation, which is that this debate is usually kind of polarized into two camps. You have the optimists and the tech evangelists who say that technology will free us all and create a new, more robust democracy by spreading information and by giving a voice to the voiceless. On the other side of the debate, you have the dystopian view where democracy will be undermined by technology and the power of the big tech firms. And like all stories, there's a bit of truth in both and a more nuanced path somewhere down the middle. And so the debate that I think we want to have today is how we harness the best of technology and manage some of the challenges through the institutions, the rules, the regulations, and the culture we create around it. I'm delighted today to have an amazing panel of speakers to help us grapple with this debate. Firstly, we have the Right Honourable John Whittingdale, OBE MP. We have Damian Collins, Chair of the Draft Online Safety Bill Committee. Welcome. We have Celine Saxby MP, Chair of the APBG on Broadband and Digital Communication. Welcome. We have Owen Meredith, Chief Executive of the News Media Association. We have Poppy Wood, Senior Advisor at Reset.tech. And finally, on our mammoth panel today, we have Hugh Millward, General Manager, Corporate External and Legal Affairs at Microsoft, who are very kindly sponsoring today's event and allowing it to happen. So thank you to Hugh. So first of all, I'm going to come to you, John, and then to you, Damian. So over to you, 3 to 5 minutes, OT.
Thanks, Harry. 3 to 5 minutes is challenging, but I will try to very briefly outline some of the issues as I see them. I mean, what we are looking at is a huge challenge, which is not facing just this country, but is a global one, which is how traditional business models, particularly in media, adapt to digital technology. What we've seen in the course of the last 15, 18 months is that the appetite for information, for news, has never been stronger, both international, national, and particularly local. But at the same time, the traditional outlets have been under increasing pressure. And we now have a position where there is a sort of cacophony of voices, which has led to a decline of trust, because it is very difficult to filter and distinguish between the social media, the information which is being percolated online, which may be abusive, it may be speculative, it may be conspiracy theories, it may be deliberate misinformation. And there is a need still for reliable, responsible and trusted journalism and fact. That is why I strongly believe we still need public service broadcasters, not just the BBC, but a plurality of news providers who do maintain a reputation for objectivity, for reliability, who go through the process of fact-checking, of sourcing, properly legaled. And alongside that, we also need a printed press, because most journalists start in the printed media, particularly in local media, and actually it is them who are under extraordinary pressure as a result of this digital transition and the disruption that is causing. So we are looking at ways of sustaining traditional newspaper outlets, and particularly local ones, because they provide the benchmark, the quality that it is possible to rely upon. And at a time when there is so much out there online which is untrue and unreliable, people need to be able to go to their traditional sources and trust that that information they are reading is correct. But that does not mean that we should just then ignore all the information swirling around on the internet, and in particular the power of social media. That is why the government had looked at the introduction of the Online Safety Bill, which is in the first instance about trying to counter some of the most harmful material, obviously stuff like child exploitation, hate speech, etc. But there is also a need, I think, to try to ensure that the few huge companies that dominate the social media sphere take some responsibility, and that's something which Damien will undoubtedly want to say more about, because he has the job of scrutinising the government's proposals in this. But it is a real challenge, because at the same time that we do need to counter damaging misinformation, things like that COVID was caused by 5G telephone masts, or that the vaccine is some government conspiracy to inject everybody with some tracking device. But you then get into more controversial areas where there is a legitimate debate taking place. Even something like climate change. There is lots of arguments still about the extent to which climate change is man-made, the extent to which we need to take action to counter it. And it is right that that kind of debate takes place, even though I may disagree with the people who are putting forward those arguments. We believe in freedom of speech. And this balance, which we have to try and draw between trying to prevent material which is harmful, and that in itself causes real problems, because the government is going to put an obligation on companies to not just remove illegal material, but harmful, and then you have to decide what is harmful but still legal, and at the same time to safeguard freedom of speech. And we have tried to put into the bill a specific duty to abide by freedom of speech concerns, and for the companies to take account of that when they reach these judgments. But it will be a very difficult balance to draw, and I'm one who leans towards the freedom of speech argument, and what we don't want is to see government censorship. But equally, there is a necessity to try and address some of the most extreme examples. And that's why I look forward to Damien's work, because I think this is going to be a fascinating debate as we move forward and the legislation goes through Parliament. Is that 3?
I think that was bang on time. You've set a standard. Over to you, Damien.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And I don't disagree with anything John has said. In some ways, as he's neatly set up, I'd like to talk a bit about the approach in the bill itself and why I think some of those measures are important. But before I get into that, I think we just have to consider, why is this happening? Is this happening because there is a shift away from online media to traditional media because online media is more popular, it's more convenient? Or is there something else happening? Is there a systems effect that's happening which has made this shift more dramatic, which has made it much easier for disinformation and conspiracy theories to become the main currency and to actually have bigger audiences than trusted news sources do? And this is disinformation by design of the platforms and the decisions they take to hold the engagement of their users. And a good example of that is set out in the book that was published this summer called An Ugly Truth, which is about Facebook. And the story of what they did around the 2020 US presidential election. They anticipated there could be a problem on election night and afterwards in conspiracy theories and claims, particularly by President Trump, about the result of the election and the integrity of the voting systems, and there would be suspicion caused. And they thought to try and dampen that effect around the poll itself, they would make a correction to the Facebook newsfeed. And that correction was that the newsfeed would favour trusted sources of news above friends and family content. Because what they had learned themselves from their own experiments was that friends and family content is the principal way through which conspiracy theories spread, largely people sharing them with each other. At the end of the week after the election, Americans had their election night on a Tuesday, so by the end of that week, they looked to see what the impact of this had been. And they noticed that it had a dramatically dampening effect on conspiracy theories about the election. It had done the job that they wanted it to do. But what they also noticed was that general engagement with the platform was much lower than they were prepared to tolerate. And so they reversed the decision. And what, if you've been following the stories coming out of America from the Facebook whistleblower, who went public last night, what she is setting out time again is that the companies are constantly faced with these challenges around holding engagement and the harm that engagement could cause. Does engagement favour the spreading of conspiracy theories and lies and disinformation? And therefore, what we should do, and I think what the bill tries to do, is make the companies accountable for those sorts of decisions, that they are not independent conduits of information. The decisions they make to hold and drive engagement from their users have a big impact on what they see. And that has seen to analysis of that election that the disinformation was spread 8 times faster than real news did through that. And a couple of years ago, I was saying this in this room yesterday, some of my colleagues in the House, I remember 2 or 3 years ago saying to me, do people really believe what they see on social media? Does that really change the way people vote? I think what we've seen, I think it does. And I think, and if that's your principal source of news, and Ofcom, the latest Ofcom Media Nations survey shows that for well over a third of people, their primary source of news, the place they go to first, is social media for news and information. If what they're seeing is a constantly repeated stream of disinformation, and as they engage with it, they get yet more extreme versions of that news and information, that does change the way that people see the world. And as John alluded to, something like COVID comes along, something new. Some people end up attacking a mobile phone mast because they've read something that tells them it's the 5G signal that's spreading the virus. Until the vaccines were rolled out, vaccine hesitancy in pretty much every country in Europe rose quite substantially because people were engaging with conspiracy theories and there was no live product. You couldn't tell whether it was safe or not. So these are the issues, and it is disinformation by design here. We also need to think of the near future and how sophisticated it might be. We're at a party conference, so many of you will be involved in campaigning and party campaigning. That in the past has been done by press releases and newsletters and Facebook books and things like that. If actually what you're fighting though is not arguments between candidates, but walls of targeted disinformation in a marginal seat to confuse what voters think about issues or to smear a candidate, or in the very near future when deep fake technology becomes so cheap that you can very easily make a fake film of a candidate saying something they never said and releasing it before the eve of poll. Or what if you have a concerted campaign designed to target a particular minority group within a constituency to persuade them not to vote or to confuse them about how and when to vote? These are all things that around the world have been going on. And they will become more and more salient, and they will be happening in our constituencies before we know it. And when these things are happening, what right and power do we have to go to the company or a platform that's facilitating this action and saying, well, you're facilitating this, you're allowing people to do it anonymously, you're undermining the democratic process and undermining in general people's confidence in the election and the institutions. What are you going to do about it? At the moment, the answer back would be, well, there's nothing we have to do about it. And why should we? If you don't like it, then campaign harder. But you're not campaigning against an opponent. You're campaigning against a machine and a system that is rigged against you. And I think if you look around the world, we have strong institutions. We have strong public service broadcasting. We have strong media, even though they're challenged by very difficult economic times. It's still easy for people to find good information. You go around the world, and including in parts of Europe, and that is no longer the case. And we should look at those countries and be concerned about what happens here. So I think the online safety bill, along with other electoral reform legislation and other things coming through, are vital to protecting the democratic public square. And I think if we don't do that, then we will have the same vulnerabilities other countries do now.
Thanks, Damien. I'm going to come to you now, Celine, if that's okay.
Thanks, Harry. And good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Celine Saxby, the MP for North Devon, as well as chairing the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Broadband and Digital Communications. And I think for my constituency in North Devon, we have very poor broadband access still. And I'm not sure if that is related or not to having one of the highest levels of anti-vaxxers, anti-5Gers, and now anti-pandemicers anywhere in the country. So I do have a concern about equality of access and making sure that people do actually have access to all of these new technologies, because actually when you have no broadband, you're struggling to get online. And in a community like mine as well in North Devon, we are so remote. We're a long way from a lot of these main media channels, and therefore some of the content is very city-centric, which is really not relevant. So we've devised our own. So we have a Facebook group in North Devon with 50,000 followers. It's called North Devon News, therefore you'd believe it was news. And my constituents will assure me this is news, because it has news in the title. It's not moderated. It's a community Facebook page which has lots of strengths, but as I'm sure you can imagine, lots of weaknesses. And they choose who's allowed on it, and I'm not. So, so I think that there are challenges around some of the powers that social media companies do have. And speaking here as the only female MP on the panel, I think it would be incorrect not to mention the level of abuse that particularly female MPs do take online, and the number of my colleagues that have now come off social media platforms, and that actually these are now being allowed to pervade, and this is cross-party. A number of us spoke out about this in a debate in Westminster Hall quite recently, and this is a way of people actually silencing us, because it's not right that our staff, because it is often our staff, deal with the sort of toxicity and the sort of lack of right to reply that you have, or in my mind I don't feel it's right that these social media platforms have the right to treat public figures differently to the rest of human beings. I don't see why, because I'm a woman, I should take that much more abuse online because I chose to represent my constituency. So I feel there's quite a lot of work to do, which I very much hope the online bill will actually bring through and enable actually my colleagues to come back onto social media platforms, because it is something I feel that the world's a lesser place if they're female MPs, and even worse than that, because it's not just about us speaking out now. We cannot get candidates because we know that what I take, that they don't want to put themselves and their families through it. And I think politics is a lesser place if over half the population is not actually represented by people that look and sound like them. So I really hope that there is change afoot, and that things can be done in that space. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hugh, I'm going to come to you now.
Okay, so there is an unhealthy information ecosystem which is really damaging our ability to protect democracy, democratic institutions and processes, communities, and viable economic markets. And I think I'm going to just frame my observations around two areas. One is the importance of local news, and the other is the rise of nation-state-sponsored cyber attack on democratic institutions, both of which are incredibly important. You know, people, as we've already heard from other panelists, have more information. They have access to more information now than they've ever had before. You know, technology is genuinely connecting people with information. I think, you know, one of the upsides of technology is that you do have that information flow. Services like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and bear in mind, I'm talking from the perspective of Microsoft and not of the tech industry more broadly. I just want to make that absolutely clear. Mean that information is ubiquitous. You know, I took a train up here yesterday, and there was delays and whatever you kind of expect. But I didn't get information about what was going on from a news source. I got it from social media. And so that information is really valuable. But it is information. It is not news. The quality, curated, edited sources of high-quality journalism, of analysis and opinion, empowered to seek the truth, investigate and uncover the hidden or the obscure, is very much in demise. And it is strong, but it's in demise. It's under threat. Having a strong local media fulfills two incredibly important functions. The first is society building. And really, we've seen over the last 18 months quite how important knitting society together really is. Creating a strong sense of itself, of a community, an identity, nurturing people who care about each other, incredibly important. But also local news is incredibly important in supporting democracy. There's no better mechanism for scrutinizing effectively the decisions of county courts, of magistrates' courts, of local authorities, and the decision making that takes place. Research conducted in the US, and I think broadly applicable, suggests that areas without a local news service are also correlated with lower voting rates, less community engagement, and increased borrowing by local government. So where do we go from here? We can't wind the clock back, even if we really wanted to. Local journalism fulfilled a need supported by an operational market. The market, in many respects, no longer works. Ubiquitous access to information makes a paid-for model challenging, and the absence of ad revenue makes a free or subsidized model equally hard. And local media fulfill the need, providing local news to local people who had no alternative means of finding it. But this is now fulfilled by tech platforms. Is media an anachronism, no longer fulfilling a need? I don't have any solutions, but we do think the debate is absolutely necessary. And if something workable emerges, then we really want to get behind it as a company. And by workable, we think that there are some principles which are quite important in this space. One is that news organizations should be paid a fair share of the money that their work generates. That the value of news should probably be negotiated. That collective bargaining is probably a good idea to put more leverage in the hands of particularly smaller outlets. Final offer arbitration also makes sense if parties can't reach an agreement. Others like other principles like non-retaliation and transparency, in particular around issues like algorithm changes that impact news referrals, incredibly important. So that's the first bit around the importance of local news. The second is nation-state sponsored cyber attack. And I think this is not as widely understood as it should be. but it is a significant threat to democracy. The number and the sophistication of these cyber attacks is, over this last 18 months, we haven't seen anything like it before. It was rising all the time, including the emergence of what are called private sector offensive actors, which are effectively they are cyber threats from the private sector, sheltered by nation states, and effectively their services are for sale. And we saw this with the NSO group. Some of you may be aware of the Pegasus cyber threat through WhatsApp. And now the intersection of COVID and cyber means that these actors are targeting healthcare research facilities and even the WHO as well. And so we need, I think, three things to try to get a handle of this. We need to get much better at sharing threat information. We need to strengthen international rules around the behaviors of actors. So, for example, that there's a that actually it's really clear under international rules that the activities of these private sector actors are in fact illegal, and that they can't be sheltered by nation states. And then in particular hold nation states accountable for attribution, so that particularly Russia, China, and North Korea are actually named and shamed for the activities that they are sheltering. So those two particular areas, real threat of technology on democracy, that we really think that there should be more action on. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Owen, over to you.
I represent the News Media Association, which is the trade body for local, national and regional press, what would traditionally be called the press. We represent members in both print and online. And others on the panel have articulated a lot of the points that I was going to make, particularly John's representation of the industry and how important trusted professional journalism is to democracy in this country. So as a avid party conference attender and having been here for, I think, now 15 years, I won't repeat that so that we can get some more time for questions. But I think one of the things that I would just frame is that in order for that journalism to be successful and to have a press as a cornerstone of our democracy, that needs to be a sustainable financial model for funding it. In the UK, we have a lower propensity amongst consumers to pay for news. That's partly as a result of free to access news in the UK through public sector broadcasters, but particularly the prevalence of the BBC online. So therefore, if we aren't going to have consumers funding journalism in the traditional way through copy sales and advertising, we need to look for different models, which is why I think the competition bill that should be coming off the back of the Digital Market Unit consultation, which the government is currently working through and will likely come in the next session, will hopefully create a framework that will allow for a bargaining code and for a code of conduct to operate between publishers and platforms, which will govern many things, but particularly looking at issues around algorithms, transparency, and how audiences are brought to those publishers and have access to that news. And I think there's incredibly important work that is going on across government here, but it's also happening very slowly. And that's partly suffered as a result of the pandemic and government being distracted rightly and focusing its attention elsewhere. But I think the first green paper that we had on what we now call the Online Safety Bill was actually published back in, I think it was 2014. So by the time we get action out of legislation, the entire world is moving so fast that it's struggling to keep up. So I think we really need to make sure that we have flexible tools within legislation to allow the government to react to the world and the reality we are facing.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Poppy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Poppy. I work at an organisation called Reset. But what feels like a lifetime ago, I was a civil servant in Downing Street working on tech policy. This is about 2012. And I remember those days where of the Arab Spring, where the meetings in Downing Street were going, guys, have you heard of this thing called Twitter? People can, on the ground, can share live opinions and tweet and hold democracy to account. And it's suddenly democratising all sorts of information to citizens in a way that hasn't been seen before. And during my period in government and the intervening period between kind of 2010 and where we are now, you saw prime ministers, leaders all over the world rolling out the red carpet for big tech, trying to attract these kind of platforms, attract their investment to the countries to ensure that innovation was really supported. And that was absolutely the right thing to be doing. We saw it happen all over the world. And I don't think, anyone thought that was, at the time, could see where we would be now. Fast forward to 2020 and a pandemic where suddenly the argument is perhaps that having information concentrated in 2 or 3 companies online is not necessarily the best thing for democracy. And I'm not saying they were the wrong choices 10 years ago. They were absolutely the right thing to be doing. But what we're dealing now is the unintended consequences of moving fast and breaking things. And so it really now is the time for government to step in to promote democracy, to promote the news media, and to ensure that the best thing, citizens are having access to information in the right way. So I think there are 3 ways that government should be tackling this. One is to regulate the business model of these companies, and something that Owen just alluded to, and we're doing that in the UK, they're doing that in Europe, and they're doing that across the piece. I think most kind of prominently in Australia, with everything that happened around news media there in the early part of this year, and we'll certainly be seeing the repercussions of that globally. You've got to focus on data protection and giving us as internet users better rights over our data, so that it's not just these kind of handful of companies that know everything about us and can do whatever they want with the data that they own. And then there's intervening on content, and so that's something that obviously this government is doing with the Online Safety Bill. And we are now at a moment where government intervening in online content is better for democracy than the status quo, where it's just 2 or 3 companies deciding what can be said online and who can say it. And so I think the Online Safety Bill has a lot to commend it in that respect. It's a really big piece of legislation of government intervention in these markets. There are some challenges to how the bill is currently drafted, but I think it can go a long way to improve what we see online. And I just want to challenge the initial assumption that you're either kind of an optimist on tech or dystopian. You can be both. You really can be both. I am pro-medicines, I'm pro-vaccinations, but I also believe in a regulated pharmaceutical industry. I have a bank account, but I'm glad that they do KYC, and I have to use that stupid dongle to access my bank and my money because it makes it safer for me. I drive a car, but I believe that seatbelts are a good thing, and that's where we are with big tech. We've had a fantastic decade for technology. It's been brilliant for all of us. We are all using fantastic technologies in our hands, in our handbags, with phones and laptops, and nobody is saying that should all be undone. We all support small businesses. We all support technological innovation in healthcare and other industries, but we've also got to be realistic about everything that we've seen in the last particularly 18 months and how bad it's been for kids, for families, for the healthcare system, and saying, no, this is time for government intervention. We do it in every other market. These companies are basically now utilities, and so I think regulation is absolutely the way to support democracy in the technology markets.
Fantastic, thank you, Poppy. Okay, I'm now going to open up to you guys to come in and ask some questions of our panel. I'm going to take them in groups of 3, and there's someone who can come and bring a microphone to you. If you could say who you are before you ask your question. So, who would like to open the conversation? So we've got a lady at the back just there, a gentleman over here next.
Hi, my name is Casey Callista, and I'm here as a consultant, but I'm also a voluntary policy advisor for Glitch, which is a UK charity working for better digital citizenship. And so my conversation is about, if we're talking about creating a democratic public square online, what are we doing to ensure that everyone can engage equally, particularly given that we know that women and minorized communities face a disproportionate amount of online abuse?
Fantastic. Gentleman just there, if you put your hand up again. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Michael. I'm from City of London constituency. My general question is around what safety mechanisms there are in the Act to prevent it being abused to restrict free speech. So in particular, I've listened to a lot what was said around, we're worried about conspiracy theories, we're worried about information, but all that to me sounds like freedom of expression. And freedom of expression is the key right that underpins democracy. So having what could be construed as a ministry of truth, being Ofcom, sounds like a step away from democracy, not closer to it.
And I'll take one more in this round. The lady in the green jacket just here.
Hi there, I'm Jenny Johnson. I'm a councillor in Wirral. I think big tech has a lot to answer for, and it's controlled by American big tech. I don't understand why we haven't entered this domain very much in the UK, and I think there's a whole space there for us to have some UK big tech. But I'm very concerned indeed about COVID examples of the deplatforming, the differing views not being accepted. I work in a university context, and we welcome critical thought, we welcome ability to question. So what might be called disinformation in some domains, in another domain is actually called about free speech, is actually able to question. And what we're finding is YouTube and Twitter in particular have taken down opposing views, and they haven't taken down paedophilia, they haven't taken down the Taliban, they haven't taken down many other things that I would think are absolutely extreme that need to be taken down. So why have they focused on COVID? That for me has made many people very angry indeed. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take another couple because we've got such a large panel. I slightly worry that we won't get to too many people. So the gentleman at the back, just there.
Hi, Tom McGrath from Good Things Foundation. We're a digital inclusion charity. There are about 10 million people without basic digital skills in the country. Do we need to ensure that we give them those basic digital skills and that training so that they can understand the benefits and dangers of being online and navigate that effectively?
And then finally this gentleman just down at the front here, and then we'll come to the panel.
Yeah, Rob Speed, Leeds North East CA. How would you counter the dark web, which has no borders whatsoever?
Great, so we've got a lot of challenging questions there. We've got equal engagement, and particularly women and minorities. We've got how do we prevent restriction of free speech in the bill. We've got how do we decide what should be taken down and what should be left up on the web. We've got digital skills, and we've got the dark web. What I'm going to do is come to each of you in turn in the order that we went to. Don't feel like you need to tackle all of them, but pick the ones you really think you want to grapple with. Over to you first.
I'm going to concentrate on the gentleman at the back and the lady here who raised free speech, because that is the issue which I was most involved in the discussions around the formation of the bill, and it's one which I think is incredibly important. We tried to put into the bill, and Damien will be sort of looking at how practical this is, two protections. The first actually is specifically for Owen and his members, because we saw that there is an importance that professionally sourced journalistic material should be available. And we didn't think it right that the big tech companies could remove content which fell into that category. Now that in itself raises huge issues around how do you define professionally produced journalistic content. What we wanted to do was ensure that, be it the Guardian, the Times, or the Sun or the Daily Mail is protected, but ISIS Times is not. And it is quite hard because some people may masquerade as being professional journalists, whereas actually they are propaganda outfits. So that is going to be one of the big debates as to how you protect this content to make sure that people are able to access it. Then you have to take into account, on the one hand, that these are privately owned companies. They are entitled to decide certain types of material they don't want. So what we said was that they need to be absolutely clear in their terms and conditions about what they will have on their platform and what they won't, and that they should also have regard for freedom of speech. And Ofcom will stand behind to act as an adjudicator where somebody feels that their material has been wrongly taken down and it breaks that freedom of speech requirement. Then they should have recourse to the company to go and say, I appeal against that. You tell me why that is in breach of your terms and conditions. And if they fail to do that, then Ofcom can intervene. But it is again a very difficult balance between trying to protect freedom of speech, and I'm, as I said at the beginning, I'm more inclined towards that wing of the argument than the sort of let's remove everything that we don't happen to like. But I do think that we do have a duty to remove stuff which is clearly damaging. And the couple of examples which we've discussed, particularly around, for instance, the 5G conspiracy or the vaccine conspiracy, which are doing real harm, where you can show that this information is leading to direct harm to people, either through arson attacks on 5G or people dying because they're terrified of taking the vaccine, then I think we do have a duty to intervene. But this is a very delicate balance, and we've tried to build in protections to ensure that freedom of speech is still regarded as one of the principles behind it.
Thank you. Damien, over to you.
Thank you. No, I'll speak about freedom of speech as well. But before I do, just to the first question about online abuse, I think this is a really serious issue. And women in particular do face, I love my parliamentary colleagues, much more abuse than men do. Do we think it's a healthy for society or even the safety of individuals for online forum to give license and credibility to misogyny, to racism, to all sorts of allegations, including threats of violence against people? It's not just the question of are people being intimidated out of public life, but are people being intimidated out of society? And evidence we received in the early public evidence sessions of the joint committee really played that back. And to hear someone like Rio Ferdinand saying that, he felt it gives license to racism and you can't shut it out. It's not like someone's shouting at you in the street. You can go back to the sanctity of your own home, but this is in the palm of your hand. And other people say, well, I can't not be on social media because my job relies on me being able to communicate on it. And I think just to say that this is just part of the modern world and we shouldn't do anything about it, and I think is wrong. And I think to look at violent attacks on women and not ask the question, are groups of men who are engaged in misogynistic behaviour and exchanging ideas, are they radicalising each other, and are they driving people to commit more violent offences? And I think looking at some of the tragic cases we've seen recently, we've got to ask ourselves those questions, because that's not a question about speech, that is a question about safety and protection and the wider harm that can be caused to society. On the freedom of speech, John set out the protections for the press that are really important, and also that prescribed organisations won't have the freedom to treat themselves as news organisations and spread sort of messages of hate with impunity. There is a lot of legislation already. We have equalities legislation, which says you can't attack someone because of their racial background, their religious beliefs. There are prescribed characteristics in the Equalities Act, which actually exist in most of the terms of services of big tech platforms, but they're not properly enforced. Now, I think we have to look at questions like, we have legislation on harassment, and we understand how that applies in the real world, but we need to look at the sort of pile-on effect of someone being bullied and intimidated in a sustained way on social media as well, and say, well, should that constitute some form of harassment? How does existing law that's existed for a long time to protect people apply here? We have laws on incitement. Yes, we believe in political free speech, but not if that freedom of speech is likely to incite criminality and violent acts against other people and violence against other people. That has always been restricted. So, and we need to also look at the amplifying role of the companies. This is not just about moderating content. Freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach. You may have a right to say something on your Facebook page, or that others may find offensive, and this bill is not going to guarantee that that we'll have a sanitized web where nothing which anyone can find offensive will be on it. But you don't have a right to have Facebook direct your messages at 3 million people for you. That is a judgment that a company makes, and I think it's right that we question whether they get those judgments right. And also, as John said, when the companies say in their terms of service that they don't allow hate speech, well, how do they enforce that, and how do they define it, and do we agree with that? To have a web where we had a highly effective mechanism for getting rid of illegal content that's already illegal in the real world, but is illegal online, to get rid of that, to make the companies do what they say they will do in their terms of service, that gets us to a much, much better place than we're in now. But we have to then work out how we strike this balance between people's freedom of speech rights and the harm that speech can cause other people, which has always been a tension in law. And when we consider that, we have to consider not just individual postings of content from a person, but the system's effect of pushing that content at very many people. And I mean, just finally, I'd say on the COVID disinformation, I think that's been the question there. It's yes, there are alternative opinions, but if the systems of technology are saying, well, actually, we think there's higher engagement with alternative opinions and conspiracy, so that actual public health information from public bodies is being drowned out by that, that's something we should have a concern with. That's not just about someone's right to have a different opinion or look at different research. It's about the balance during a public health emergency, and I think that is something we do have to take more seriously, particularly during a pandemic.
Thanks, Damien. Selene, over to you.
Thank you. I was going to touch on digital skills as it's something that I was a maths teacher just before I was elected, and I think there is a real concern. I was with the Chief Exec of Openreach just before coming to this session, discussing with him the confusion around technology and people not even knowing what they don't know because it's now so confusing. Who knows which type of fibre you've got and what is gigabit capable? But I think it does mean that there is a real digital divide, and how do we actually ensure that people know what they're accessing? And coming to the point the lady in green made about once you that are well educated, you then have a better chance of discerning what is true and what is false information. And I think it's how do we get that balance into society. And I think we've seen through the pandemic that we're not good at assessing risk. And as a mathematician, it's been fascinating watching how we analyse risk and listening to people like Professor Spiegelhotter speak at length about how do we decide the risks that we are prepared to take as individuals. And I think the same is true with the news. And I think it's a conversation I was having with the gentleman earlier about what is news and what is sort of a magazine type programme or what is opinion. And I think sometimes we've started to believe that what's on social media is news when it is often somebody's opinion, which they're very entitled to have and share. But having spent breakfast with the BBC World Service, that's news. You know, when you're doing that level of very detailed, complex, brilliant investigative journalism and reporting on it. And I think we somehow need to find the right language to ensure that people are able to analyse what's in front of them. And unfortunately, as a former teacher myself, I'm not sure we were perhaps giving youngsters all of those skills until they get a little bit further into their university education to be able to really understand the difference between those sort of 2-3 different channels.
And Owen?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's two things. One, as John points out, there is provisions within the draft bill that specifically sort of carve out news publishers, and the definition in the bill is a very good one. It's workable. The industry thinks that it's acceptable. It doesn't stray into sort of state licensing or state recognition of publishers. So it's protecting a free press whilst delivering what needs to be achieved in terms of ensuring that content isn't taken down based on political opinion or whatever else. I think the other factor that goes back to, I think it's Tom's question at the back, is around media literacy and skills. Actually, people are exposed to more information than they have ever been able to, and they need to have the skills and be taught from a very young age how to navigate that online world, how to interpret, how to understand what the difference between a Facebook community group and people posting in that might be sort of posing as news versus professionally curated journalism that is in a controlled fashion, editorially controlled. And we really need to beef up and invest in our media literacy strategy so that people can navigate the online world that we're now living in.
And finally, Poppy, I don't know how confident you are talking about the dark web, but that's the one unanswered question we have left. But go for what you wanted to touch on.
Pass on the dark web, I'm afraid. But the questions around free speech and the first question as well about public square. You know, the platforms, the social media platforms, like to say that they are the public square of the internet. But if you really went to a public square, I don't know where you go now, but Speaker's Corner, say, to state your opinion on something, the people who would hear that would be the people who've opted in to come and listen to someone speaking at Speaker's Corner. And maybe if you had a megaphone, you might be able to reach some people on Oxford Street. But, you know, you're not going to reach 2.8 billion people when you state your opinion in the real world. And so it's a false analogy to say that they are the public square of the internet, because the defenders of free speech often say, well, you know, I have a right to state my opinion online and for the maximum audience to hear it. And this is what Damien was saying about the difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach. Actually, often people are defending reach and not speech. And I think that conflation needs to be kind of differentiated, particularly in the bill. And so the bill is looking in many ways at reach. How do you tackle reach whilst protecting speech? And I think it does that in a lot of good ways. I'd say I do have some concerns about where the bill on legal speech. By deferring the management of legal speech to the company's terms and conditions, I do worry that we're in a position where the platforms could continue to take down legal speech without recourse, and that for example, for illegal speech online, sorry, I'm getting into the weeds of the bill here, the bill is talking about mitigating the harm, minimising the risk, etc. But for legal speech, it's deferring that management to terms and conditions of the companies. And I would say much better to talk about risk mitigation for legal harm rather than potentially deleting legal content. So sorry, I got into the weeds of the bill there. But just stepping back out a bit, the first question about, you know, minority groups and people with protected characteristics not being able to engage online, it's another argument in the free speech camp, which is free speech is not just about free speech for straight white men. It is much broader than that, and you are already seeing a lot of voices who aren't in that category self-censoring and not engaging online, as we saw from, you know, Rio Ferdinand's testimony, but plenty of women and girls and people who are exploring their sexuality, who want to engage online but cannot do so for fear of abuse. So there is already major infringement of free speech online, and I think the bill needs to account for free speech for all, not just for the loudest voices in the digital room. And that I think the bill's getting there on that, and certainly if it's looking at tackling abuse, it will buoy those voices a bit more, because they really don't have the confidence to engage online without abuse at the moment. So all to say that the bill is good in many ways in tackling some of these things, and I think free speech is absolutely well underpinned as a cornerstone of the regulation.
Hugh, I've got my ordering wrong, but you can come in next.
Yeah. Thank you. I won't take the dark web either. I don't know what we're going to do about that. Blame the US government for developing it, I suppose. I mean, so online harms. I mean, actually, from what we see of the ways in which governments across the world are tackling this issue, actually the way in which the UK is looking at it is probably some of the most exciting and most progressive. Actually, this idea of a duty of care is a really positive step. It's a really good, but it's hard. And one of the reasons why there is this debate going on in this room and others, we're actually dealing with issues that are really hard. And there's this tension at the heart of it where, you know, we've got to navigate our way through. Because in some respects, and looking at it really simply, what we're really trying to do is trying to hold Twitter accountable for Donald Trump's tweets. And that's hard. It's a hard thing to do. It means that someone has got to take it. So, John, I mean, you were talking about we have a duty to intervene. And I guess it's, well, so who's the we in that? Because is that platforms taking content, making content decisions, or is it governments making content decisions? And actually, we haven't really found a path through that is clear on that kind of thing yet. So it is the debate, it's the kind of the conversation in the room that's so important that we actually move towards that. Tom, just your point there about the Good Things Foundation, about digital skills, absolutely crucial, but actually we need the Good Things Foundation to keep doing what they're doing. And we need Future.now, and we need to improve this digital literacy, because as you said earlier, a moment ago, actually having people understand not just the functional skills with which they can get on in life and get a job and be productive, but also understand the context in which social media is operating, context in which news is operating, I think is incredibly important as well. So keep going, Good Things Foundation, please.
Sorry, can I just come back on what you said? I wouldn't characterise the bill as being about making Twitter responsible for Donald Trump's tweets. I think what I would say is actually, if you Twitter allow anonymous accounts to abuse England footballers, and not only do you do that, you actually promote the N-word as a trending topic while it's going on to draw attention to it and encourage more people to join in. That's what we're holding you to responsible for. There's a lot of abuse that takes place. They do very little to stop, and I think too many of them look at content that could be harmful and abusive, and they see it drives engagement. And they let it go because they want that engagement to take place. And within that system, you've got to have a mechanism that says, okay, the issue here is not just bad people post bad stuff, and it's the bad people that are responsible for it. It's saying if you are hosting that content and you're promoting it and you're driving it, and because it drives engagement, which helps you make money, that's a business transaction that you're profiting from. And therefore, just like in any other industry, I think it's fair that the decisions you take to make that money can be regulated.
John, I think you wanted to come in on the dark web.
I was going to come in very quickly on dark web, but not to provide a solution. But it is one of another really controversial and difficult ethical issues. The dark web is a means by which people can exchange information, or indeed maybe sell things anonymously. You do it without any ability to identify or be seen to be doing it. Now, obviously, GCHQ, National Cybersecurity Centre, are very active in tracing what is going on the dark web. But it illustrates what is another very difficult balance to draw, and that is the balance between people's right to privacy and the need to protect people from unlawful and harmful activity. And the dark web is an extreme example, but it is one that we are also seeing now in the very active argument taking place over end-to-end encryption on WhatsApp, where WhatsApp will say this is a really good thing. We are protecting people's privacy. We're going to ensure that they're less likely to be subject to cybercrime. They're entitled to this as one of fundamental human right. But then the security services, law enforcement turn around and say, but this is an open charter for paedophiles, for terrorists, and we can't monitor them. And that is a very active argument going on at the moment. But ultimately, the tech companies are going to, again, have to accept that there is a requirement which government is entitled to impose for the protection of citizens to have some access to identify those people who have very bad intentions. Where I agree we should not go is to give a blanket ability to just sort of listen in to whoever we want. It needs to be very strictly controlled. But it's another of these very hard dilemmas that government is wrestling with at present.
Thanks. So another round of questions. There's a lady in pink just here. Keep your hands up and I'll come to you next.
Hi, I'm Denise Priest from University of Liverpool. There's a few things that I think need to be followed up on, really. One is, I've just had lunch here. If you look at your bag of crisps, you know the content, you know its origins. That's a bag of crisps. This is information that can kill. I think we should be putting a digital footprint that we can see its origins, where it's come from. And I think that's really, really important. So we can code them. And going back to that education element, we can code information very, very clearly about where it's come from, the country of origin, who sent it. And I think that should be now. I don't think it should be then. And I think people can self-educate when you give them a decent label. I don't think that we're beyond that. I think the other thing is follow the money. And I don't, we talk about the digital world as if it's not real, and the real world as if it is. Well, actually now, since COVID, the digital world is more real than the real world for many people. Includes all of my kids who actually see it now as the real world. That's where they communicate. So when we talk about the corner where we can shout out, well, actually now, the web is. So for me, we should police and monitor and policy just as strongly as any public space. And I think finally, this notion of anonymity, I think is ridiculous, because you would never get that in real world. You cannot be anonymous in the real world. So when we try and argue that anonymity is fine online, actually it isn't, because we wouldn't allow that in our public spaces and places, and we wouldn't allow that in law. People have to be, you have to know the origin of any sort of information. So it's more some observations, but my background is IT, and none of this is beyond the ability of the tech.
The gentleman at the back and the left, or my left, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Michael Gbadebo. I'm a local councillor and also a software engineer. There were bullies before the internet. There were racists before the internet. There were bad people before the internet. I think we're spending a lot of energy attacking the tech companies. They're just platforms. The more regulations you put in place, the more innovative they get to get around those regulations. One of the key things I think we need to do, and the government needs to focus on, is educating the citizens about trust, about where to find good information. We don't actually have a .gov app, for example. You have to go to a website. Right, so it's important that we educate the young people, everybody actually, where to find trusted information. And I just want to add, lastly, the News Media Association. I go elsewhere to find my news because I've stopped trusting journalism. I will read in one, front page, Express, the Tories are raising taxes or cutting taxes. I read in The Guardian, the Tories are doing something else. So it's about trust, and mindful that you're not having that conversation with your association members. You need to build trust, and people will come back to the news or traditional news medium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady just here in the purple top. And I'll take two more after that.
Thanks. My name's Claire Golby. I'm a local councillor. And Selene, you've said about getting abuse as an MP. Well, that also filters down to a local level to people like me. And I've got a particular issue with another councillor who is not from the same party as us, who is quite vindictive online, sells just below the threshold of where he needs to be for it to be legal, and I cannot do anything about it. And it's really difficult for me to have to just sit back and watch this. There's nothing I can do. But he incites other people. I've been to the police. It doesn't work. How are you going to enforce legislation? For example, we all know that there are speed limits, but people still speed because you can't enforce speed limits on everybody at that point of them putting their foot on the accelerator. So it's all very well and good having legislation, but how is it going to be effectively enforced for people like me, individuals like me, that are really at the end of the chain and not sort of don't have any recourse?
Great. I'm going to take someone on the right. I've got a bit of a left bias. At the back there.
Please, IPPR. Nicholas Taylor from Revolut. Do you think we can have a trustworthy online world where online advertising remains largely unregulated, particularly in the context of banking and fraud, where criminals pay platforms like Google tens of thousands of pounds to appear at the top of searches for banking login pages?
Great. And one more question. The lady in green just here.
Thank you. Noah Cohen, the Advertising Association. You've touched on the importance. I won't address that. You've touched on the importance of media literacy, and I was just wondering your thoughts on DCMS's media literacy strategy. Do you think it will go far enough to address this? Are you optimistic, or do you think it needs to be more ambitious?
Fantastic. So, I'm going to come to you first, John. Again, as per last time, take the ones you fancy and leave the ones you don't.
The issue around anonymity is a really interesting one, and I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that we need to make it easier to identify people. There are caveats to that. The first is, Poppy, I think, referred at the beginning to the Arab Spring and the power of Twitter. One of the benefits of social media is that it has been used in places which are not as open and free and democratic as we are here, to expose abuse, to reveal corruption, to campaign against authoritarian, and those countries would love to be able to identify who is using it. So whenever we look at this, I've always been very keen that we should just think to ourselves, we must be careful we are not setting a precedent that Mr. Putin will turn around and say, well, look, they're doing it in Britain, so what's the harm in my doing it? So there is a risk there. The other thing is the simple challenge, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't go down this road, and I think Damien will want to look at this in his consideration of the bill. But I don't know how many users Facebook has now, but it's sort of in the billions. And to verify the identity of every single one is hugely difficult. And obviously the tech platforms. Well, I mean, if you are, if you're saying to Facebook, every single one of your users you have to verify before you allow them onto the platform. I mean, I do think, the first thing that will do is massively reduce the use of Facebook, which you may say is not a bad thing. But it is a huge intervention against companies, which I think we just need to be careful as to precisely how. Now, I would prefer to have it a system where it were easier to obtain the identity of people who are plainly abusing it. So you don't necessarily have to provide your identity to the world, but where the police say this person is, some examples Damien has given in terms of hate speech or using it for clearly illegal purposes, then it needs to be easier to identify who they are. And that, I think, is possible. But I just caution that I think requiring blanket removal of anonymity carries with it some difficulties and some risks.
Damien, do you want to go?
Yeah. So on anonymity, I mean, different platforms have different services. And actually, Facebook's policy by default is that you're supposed to be who you say you are. I mean, there are about 2.5 billion active monthly users for Facebook. They say they take down about a billion accounts a quarter, through those checks. So they have got systems to try and do it. Are they effective enough is a different question. They hold as well a huge amount, all these companies hold a huge amount of data about individuals. So even if you're using a false name, they still know probably pretty much where you live, when you post, sites you visit. They probably could identify you from the data they hold. And I think there's a question there as to say, as part of a law enforcement investigation, should the police have the right to go to say, okay, we can see someone is behaving in an aggressive way. What they're doing is illegal. If we knew their name and address, we would go and charge them. But we can't do that because we can't identify them. Should a company be able to go to a judge and get a warrant to get that information released from the company? We'll see what the company has, and could you, even on top of that, build into the system a requirement the company should hold enough information to make it someone identifiable. There is that question which John raised about, oppressive regimes will look at that and they will look to close down anonymity in their countries. My concern about that is that I don't think oppressive regimes need any help from us in how they can oppress their own people. They're pretty effective at that. And also, does it really exist? We see the stories about the Pegasus project story about how dissidents and citizen journalists and opposition figures in other countries, in oppressive regimes, are spied on, and their identity is well known. So in this context, I think the question we have to think about is, what is anonymity achieving? Is it actually making it easier for people to abuse others, but is doing nothing to protect people that deserve the protection of anonymity because they otherwise will be targets? And I think we have to get that right. But I think I'm coming around to, I think, a lot of the problems that related to abusive behaviour and illegal abusive behaviour is linked to the fact that people know they can't be traced. And of course, the other thing the companies could do is just close the accounts down. That's another way of solving anonymity, that if you behave in a way that's abusive, you can't use anonymity as your shield, and you should have maybe fewer rights than if, than would be the case. In terms of the gentleman at the back said that, just looking up at me now, you said that they're just platforms, and I disagree with that. I think if they were just platforms, I think what you said would be right. Because if when you went onto social media, all that you saw was an organic list of content that people you've chosen to follow have posted in order, then that would be a platform. But what you see instead is that content ranked and selected and profiled for you, or even pushed at you to hold your engagement. Now, if your interest is baking cakes, there's not a lot of harm that can come from that. But if your interest is more extreme ideas, then I think the platforms play a role in radicalizing people to hold yet more extreme ideas, and they create communities where people who hold radical ideas can share them with each other. Now, research that Facebook did looking at this showed that 60% of people on Facebook that joined Facebook groups where extremist ideas were being shared, did so at the active recommendation of Facebook. And that's why I say they're not just a platform, they're playing an active role in making these things happen. In terms of online ads and scams, the issue I have here, and I know ads aren't in the scope of the bill, the question I have in my mind is, should the bill address harmful content and online safety in whatever form it takes on media? If I posted something that would require the platform to take it down because it was in breach of their terms of service, and therefore the Online Safety Act requires them to remove it, or it's illegal and the Online Safety Act requires them to remove it. And so let's say we have ads on consumer protection, we have laws on consumer protection, we have laws on fraud, a lot of these scam ads would be illegal. Should we say, well, okay, if you posted that material organically, just on your page, that has to come down. But if you paid Facebook to distribute that content to other people, so it has a bigger audience, that's fine, that's an ad, and therefore it's out of scope. I think if that's where we end up, I think but the public would say, well, this is clearly a nonsense. Actually, it's the stuff that what you're saying is, if I help Facebook or Twitter or whoever else make money out of this, I had a financial scam ad on Twitter directed to me the other day, actually, which I've kept a record of. Should we just let this go because there's advertising? We actually already have a procedure to identify ads that shouldn't be running, that on television, in print, and in print, a news organisation, a news editor is liable for the content of an ad. In television, if a broadcaster runs an ad that the ASA have ruled against, that can be held against them when their licence renewal comes up. So why would we say that actually for the biggest ad markets in the world, the most dominant, the most lucrative, they have a total free pass and can run with impunity and make money out of something that in any other media will be required to be taken down? So.
Selene, over to you.
Thank you. And coming to the point the gentleman made at the back about trust, I wish we didn't have 24-hour news, because certainly I'm old enough to remember that you used to sit down and watch the 9 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock, and that was the news. And if you missed it, you missed the news. Whereas now you can never miss the news. And I think at least Radio 4 still defines that today is a chat programme, and then we have the news. And there's a differentiation between the two, and I think we've sort of lost that, and it's very blurry, and it takes me back to the pandemic. And actually in the early days of the pandemic, that 5 o'clock press conference, you know, became a real focal point. I don't know if that's just my job, but it was a real focal point. You know, the world stopped because we needed to hear what was coming out of government ministers, and whether you agree with that approach, that was the nearest thing we had to accurate news about what was happening in the pandemic that day. And I think that was a real positive for a lot of us at that time, because it was something you could hold on to. At least you had the best information that the professors had at that point in time. And I think we have lost that, and it's sad that we don't always have those trusted sources. And I think it's interesting, actually, as a former maths teacher, that we've looked to scientists for that. And I hope moving forward, as we tackle things like climate change, we will again look to scientists to perhaps guide some of that rather than just us chatting about it. But with regards to the lady who spoke about and the counsellor and the issues there, and I think it's slightly out of the scope of this session, but violence against women and girls is obviously very much in the media at the present time. And I think how we tackle that and what is appropriate to be dealt with by the police. I have my own literal ongoing case, because this doesn't just happen online. I'm dealing with a case with the police of what happens on the street as well, which then filters through. And it's where does it cross the bridge between what's effective political debate and people challenging our political beliefs, and when does it cross that line? And I think, you know, this week in my life it has very clearly crossed that line. And so I think, you know, it is about calling it out when it does, and it's a really difficult place to be. But I do hope that there are others of us at Westminster working hard to actually make sure, and I think the Prime Minister himself this week has really spoken out to make sure that violence against women and girls is properly tackled.
Hugh, over to you.
Yeah, just two quick points. Michael, I think it's your point about they were bad people before the internet. We've been running a campaign for the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and an annual survey to go with it around digital civility, trying to actually improve the quality of discourse online. It does feel like pushing water uphill quite a lot of the time. But actually, what we find is, of the 32 countries that we survey each year, actually the quality of debate online and the safety that people feel in this country is actually one of the highest of those 32 countries, which is also incredibly worrying. Just, you know, the bottom of the scale, you kind of really do worry about what's going on. But it is something that we try to push, including, you know, how to. We're talking about defending democracy here. How do we make sure that the discourse allows for, you know, is civil enough to allow for competing ideas and for the exchange of ideas? And, you know, technology is an enabler for that. But just constant pressure, try to make sure that things are more civil than less. And Denise, your question about identity. There's some really interesting work that we're doing with the BBC and with Adobe and one or two other companies to effectively watermark news content, so that you can then identify if it's been interfered with at any point subsequently. And it is exciting. It's quite nascent at the moment, but I think it's an area where actually there is quite a lot of innovation going on that will make a difference to disinformation, particularly deepfake. Damien, you were talking about what happens if you have a content purporting to be a candidate just before an election or whatever it might be. Actually, this is one of the mechanisms by which we actually might be able to solve some of these things. But it does need collaboration more broadly across the industry, not just a couple of industry players driving it. It does need to be pretty much everybody involved.
But that's the same as the press. You all agree to a pact, don't you?
Yeah.
And this is why I get so frustrated that we pretend online is different to real life, and it isn't. The legislation should be exactly the same. The rules of engagement.
Oh, and over to you.
Yeah, just to go back to Michael's point directly, you say that you stopped reading the press because you don't trust journalism, but overwhelmingly trackers from Ofcom and various surveys show that people do, and 49 million people a week in this country read the press in print and online. So I'm hoping, not least for my job, that you're in a minority there. But it's an interesting question, because I think the more people are exposed to lots of different sources of information, the more they need to be able to learn to challenge it. And I think people traditionally would have got their news, Selene says, by sitting down and watching the 6 or 10, or by reading a newspaper, buying a physical newspaper at which you don't just read the bits of content that you're interested in. You buy skipping through the pages, you see what else is happening in the world around you. And I think the problem in the online environment is that people have become very much focused and driven to content that appeals to their existing interests, and therefore they don't have a wider range of reading. They don't get exposed to information that they're not directly looking for in the same way. And I would echo Damien's comments in terms of your reference as to these are just platforms. They're not, because of the actions that they're doing and how they're taking, what they're doing to content once it's put there.
Poppy.
Sure, and just carrying on that point about lack of trust in news media, the reality is if you decide you don't want to read The Guardian or The Times or The Telegraph, you can go elsewhere. There's not that plurality in the digital ecosystem. There are 2 or 3 companies where you get your information, and if you choose to opt out of those, there's nowhere else to go. I'm not on Facebook, and that means I can't access all sorts of things in my local community because they only operate on Facebook. Some of the groups that you want to engage with, the Neighbourhood Watch, etc., they only run on Facebook. And so if you opt out of that, which is a choice, you can't find that anywhere else. And so until we have that better competition in these digital markets, it's not as easy to find your information elsewhere. And that's why our news media and the plurality there is so fantastic, particularly in the UK, because you do have choice if you've lost faith in one organisation or another, but you don't online. And so it is very different, and there are lots of differences between the online and the offline world. The point about anonymity, Facebook has a real name policy. So when you're engaging on Facebook, you're meant to be operating in your own name. And there's still a lot of abuse on Facebook. We've heard about other people in the room who are receiving it. And so it's not as clear cut as if you ban anonymity, online abuse will go away. It might be easier to track, but it's much more layered. And I think one of the issues with kind of legislation at the moment and policymakers is they're saying, okay, so we either need to ban anonymity or say nothing about it. And there are more nuanced approaches to that. There are important protections for people who are whistleblowers or exploring their identity online, where anonymity is a really important tool. And then there are lots of instances where it's abused. And so it's not as clear cut as one thing or the other. And I think policymakers are starting to understand that there's different layers to it, and it can be quite nuanced. And then the final point I wanted to pick up was on enforcement. It's all very well and good to say all this great stuff's happening, but actually will it be enforced, and will it make a difference for users and victims of abuse? It's really important that the regulator of this regime, which is Ofcom, is sufficiently tooled up to deliver this agenda. They're hiring like 300 or 400 people, which for a regulator is an enormous amount of people. A lot of them are going to be based in Manchester, I believe. And so, we hope that lots of resource goes into this regulator to improving their monitoring of the harm that we're seeing online. They need to have the relevant tools in order to deliver on enforcement, and I think there's some very powerful tools in this bill that will mean that they can respond. But then also in the bill there's stuff on redress mechanisms for victims of harm, improving the reporting mechanisms, etc. And so I'm not defending the bill as a solution to say that it will stop all of the hate that people are seeing online and make it completely go away. We don't live in a perfectly secure society. But I do think it's getting there, and it's really important that civil society and victims of abuse are engaging with government and are formally involved in these conversations, so that it's not just about what people think should happen, but what actually is really happening to people when they receive abuse, and what happens when they report it. So I do encourage groups that are working in that space and victims groups to engage with government on some of those conversations, because otherwise the decisions will be made for them, and actually it's got to be made with them.
Fantastic. I'm going to take one more round of questions, so this is your last opportunity to question our amazing panel. Please put your hands up and I will get Lara to bring the microphone round to you. Who would like to come in? The gentleman just on the right here.
So I'll do a quick follow-up. So 2 politicians have been in the press recently with conference. First one is Liz Truss, who said women have cervixes. And the second one is Angela Rayner, who said Tory scum. So both of which sounds like hate speech. both of which sounds like could cause harm to people. Which one are we going to ban from the platforms?
Who else would like to come in before we wrap up? The gentleman just here.
Hiya. So my question would be, we talked about attribution when it comes to kind of nation-state actors, but how are we meaning to kind of put policies in place so that domestic actors also kind of can face the same kind of measures as a nation-state actor would? So QAnon's a perfect example of that, a coordinated domestic actor. We have a lot in the UK as well, one being Jeremy Corbyn's brother. But yeah, how do you handle kind of coordinated domestic actors versus nation states?
And anyone else before we wrap up? The gentleman right at the back.
My name is Andres. I'm an officer in.
Could you speak up a little bit? We're struggling
I'm
to
an
hear.
officer in Conservative Association, community licensing officer. My question is, well, you already talked about this, but a bit more in detail, maybe how to protect the internet from the content which comes from other countries, that harmful content. If well, it is anonymity. It is. Some of it is needed, but how to make such things, like for what is allowed for one country, not allowed for other country, for example, for more developed. About this a bit more, if you could.
Great. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there then. So over to the panels. We've got a question about domestic and non-domestic actors. We've got a question about Liz Truss versus Angela Rayner. And we've got how do we protect ourselves from other countries and intervening in digital. John, do you want to come in first?
God. The gentleman's challenge, I mean, you illustrate exactly the difficulty here, which is when does it stop being free speech and when does it start being harmful? I mean, the debate about trans is not something I think any of us would be keen to get into here, but I mean, it is provoking incredibly strong reactions, and if anything, it's the lobby who will be attacking Liz for her remarks, who are most intolerant. It is a perfectly legitimate debate. Liz is perfectly entitled to make that remark. Actually, to some extent, Angela is too. I mean, I think you have to try and distinguish between speech which may be controversial, it may even offend people, but it doesn't do harm. And I think that is the test. And some of the examples which Damien's given and others and Selene of where actually this is doing real harm, and race or gender hatred or whatever it happens to be, but abuse of women, not just MPs, although female MPs have suffered particularly, that is going beyond Angela Rayner saying Tory scum. I don't like Angela Rayner saying Tory scum, but I wouldn't lock her up for doing so. But well, beating up people is clearly a breach of the law, but using very strong language is not. I don't think you would convict Angela Rayner for incitement to beat up Tories by saying Tory scum. Yeah, but I mean, it is a difficult line to draw, but that's where I would try to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what John has said. The test, I think, for politicians is, and politicians have personal jeopardy. They're saying stuff on the record. They've said it. People will judge them based on what they've said, whether they agree with it or they disagree with it. The question would be is, at what point does what a politician has said create a situation where harm or real violence could occur? And I think where you saw with the intervention with Donald Trump, the intervention with President Bolsonaro in Brazil, was around, with Donald Trump, was around incitement. It was around a riot. A riot took place. The company took a view. He helped incite, and on the day helped make worse, and 5 people lost their lives. and therefore he was stopped for that. You know, not because he was airing views that people disagree with or others might find offensive, because a riot took place in which 5 people died, and they thought the president was helping to incite that riot. With President Bolsonaro, he was actively recommending things in order to treat people for COVID. If they'd done them, they'd followed his advice, they would be harmed. And therefore, his intervention to say this is not a matter of debate, this is actually someone who's advocating something that is likely to cause violence or real harm. Liz and Angela's views on those subjects, they've expressed them. I don't think that's something that will be in scope with the Online Safety Bill. The Online Safety Bill is not there to say we will stop anything that anyone finds offensive being online. The question is, does it lead to likely real world harm? You know, if someone was posting, let's all hang out outside the Midland tonight and get the Tories when they come out the bar, and you've got a riotous mob there with clubs. If that was trending on Twitter and encouraging more people to come, I'd say that's probably harmful. And that's something you'd expect an intervention to come at that point. So I think it is understanding the likely and imminence of real harm. There is something more complex that sits within that as well, that's why I mentioned earlier, how does things like harassment law sit in this as well? Where does something like cyberbullying sit? Where actually it's not that one individual thing has been said that someone might take offence to, but they are being constantly hounded and harassed and bullied with increasingly intimidatory language. And that system's effect over a sustained period of time, which in other areas of law we recognise as being harmful, but we've not really worked out how that works in this space. So that's how I would see this. This is not a bill about saying we're going to create a sanitised web with where anything that someone might find upsetting has got to be taken down straight away. It is more complicated than that. It's based on the real level of likely threat. The other point I'd say about foreign states and outside actors is that a lot of this can be tracked. We can see large networks of inauthentic accounts that are engaged in interventions, not just around elections, around controversial issues and topics. And we can see the companies are monitoring that. And part of it is saying what are their policies to deal with those networks, particularly if they're bot accounts and inauthentic accounts. A bot account doesn't have First Amendment rights in America. It doesn't have freedom of speech rights in the UK. It's inauthentic. It's being manipulated to create an effect, to influence the algorithm, to influence what people see. And those sorts of systems, I think, the regulator can take a view on those, particularly where it's inauthentic. And this final thing I'd say, which also touches on a question we had earlier, which is about building jeopardy in the system for the tech companies on how they interpret and enforce the regulations, which works in banking. If a bank can see someone who's sees a suspicious transaction, they flag it. They flag it with, if your account, they flag it with you. They flag it with the authorities if it's a bigger mechanism. They know if it was later discovered they could have flagged it and didn't, and they'll get into trouble. So if we can see, for example, the Russians are buying ads to target voters in the UK in rubles from St. Petersburg, which is an electoral offence in the UK, it's a criminal act, then and the companies can see it. Why don't we say to the companies, actually, it's not your job to wait for the police or the Electoral Commission to discover it and come and tell you about it. You should have a responsibility to proactively monitor, suspicious and inauthentic activity, and to do something about that. And I think the regulators should be able to audit companies on that basis, and that may do, as exists in other industries, companies become more proactively compliant with regulation because they understand they can be held to account for the decisions they make.
Selene.
Thank you, and I'd just like to say these are my personal views, and I don't mean to cause any offence before I open my mouth on this one, but that as a woman, I'm fed up with being described as a collection of body parts, just full stop. So I think I've hopefully got a bit more to add. And with regards to Angela's comments, I think it's important to put them in context that was not the first time that Angela referred to the opposition as scum, and the first time it happened, for those of you who follow it closely, that night a large number of my colleagues received death threats. And so whilst that was, she's just quite entitled to her views and to express them in the manner she feels fit, what happened the time before was very different. And I think, therefore, certainly my police force felt the incident I dealt with on Monday was related to what happened on Saturday night. Because if we feel it's acceptable to speak to each other like that, I'm a big advocate of polite politics and talking about policies and not people. And I feel that a line was crossed on that evening. And I hope that at some point she'll manage to apologise, which she refused to do the first time in the chamber as well.
And Hugh, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm just refer back to the comment about digital civility, actually, on some of those comments, and how do you improve the quality of discourse online. But I think, it's less it's as much a question of who makes the decision and at the point at which something becomes it's not harmful and then it becomes more and more harmful, and then at what point then what tips it, and who makes that decision about what tips it. And I think what Damien has mentioned a moment ago, our worry about that is that actually it would lead to if it's left to the platforms to censor effectively, which is a worry for freedom of speech. That's all I say. On the international, I mean, I think your question about the laws of different countries, I mean, we have to abide by the, it's often said that tech companies are unregulated. We're actually not. We're actually regulated in every country in which we operate. And we have to abide by the laws of every country in which we operate. And so online harms comes in the UK, we will abide by those laws and we will apply those. And in exactly the same way, in any other country, we abide by the law of the land. We're not above the law. And so, I'm not quite sure where your question was going on that, but what's completely clear is that we will abide by, we'll fulfill our duty as a corporate citizen.
And Owen?
I think the only thing I would add is, I think clearly this is a complicated area and it's going to be complicated in law. So I think the government having this process, the joint committee and the draft bill, is a very welcome one. I think the government's done a very good job in engaging with industry, and I'm sure Damien has got his work cut out, particularly by his December deadline, to look through and chew over a lot of these details. But I think it's a very welcome process, and we look forward to seeing the results of it. But I would also just add that this law probably won't be perfect. We won't get everything that needs to be done. We won't, the internet will not suddenly be a new safe space online overnight. So we just need to be realistic about what it can achieve, and not let perfect be the enemy of the good.
And Poppy, over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The question about domestic versus foreign actors and coordinated behaviour, that actually played out in a very public way, of course, in the US. And I think, so you had the US presidential election in November. A lot of the disinformation that was circulating online in advance of that election was being pushed by foreign state actors. And then the intervening period between the election and the insurrection, much of the disinformation was being pushed by domestic actors. So it's often hard to kind of differentiate between the two, but we've seen a national security report in the US that says it was foreign interference before, and then a leaked report by Facebook that said it was mostly domestic actors. And so, but both groups were taking similar approaches to how they pushed their disinformation. So they were coordinating, they were working together, just skirting the fringes of the regulations of the platforms so that they wouldn't be identified, and that they were weaponizing the systems and processes of the platforms to push the most controversial, most subversive, most provocative content so that it would be recommended to users and drive the most engagement. This is the attention optimization business model that the tech platforms operate under. So that is to say that domestic or foreign, they still apply the same tactics and same rules and coordinated behavior. And it's very hard to differentiate in many ways between those two. And I think the Online Safety Bill doesn't quite go as far as it could in looking at that kind of coordinated disinformation that we saw in the States. If you take, for example, what's happening in Scotland and the Scottish referendum, I spoke about this yesterday, so apologies if you were here yesterday, but we've already seen evidence of coordinated disinformation campaigns promoting pro-referendum propaganda in Scotland. It's been confirmed by Facebook and Twitter that they're backed by Russian and Iranian backers, and we're seeing kind of Free Scotland accounts that purport to be domestic, local Scottish groups that are talking about how bad the Conservative Party is for the Union, how bad the monarchy is for the Union, trying to stoke up those kind of internal domestic tensions. And I do worry that disinformation is a bit of political hot potato. It's not quite in the Online Safety Bill. It's not quite being covered by the security services. It's not quite being covered in the Elections Bill, because it's a very difficult area. We're talking about subjective judgment here. But when we're talking about coordinated disinformation campaigns to undermine democracy, I think government should tackle that head on, and I'm not quite sure the bill goes far enough yet. So I would call on government to think about how we can avoid a situation that we saw in the US in, say, for example, the aftermath of a Scottish referendum. if one takes place. And then just the final question that was asked about, different regulations. There's a kind of sense that wouldn't it be wonderful if there was one set of regulations for tech platforms globally and they had to adhere and that was it. And that's just never going to happen. That's not how it worked. Worked for financial services. It's not how it's going to work. But it would certainly be in the interest of big tech to wait for that moment. There is a groundswell of support for regulation in different jurisdictions. So the Online Safety Bill, of course, have been spoken about here, but you've got equivalent regulations in Europe. The EU is pushing its Digital Services Act through at the moment. You've got Australia, Canada, certain things in the United States. Germany's done a lot, France has done a lot, Ireland's done a lot. So there's a sense that everybody's trying to grapple with these big issues. Governments taking different approaches to it. I would say what's happening in the UK is very advanced. It's very kind of well thought out of the nuances of these platforms. It's not just take everything down, which some regulations are. It's much more, as I say, nuanced and thoughtful about how we're dealing with some difficult issues, and policy has to reflect that. So it's great that different countries are trying to do different things, or at least trying to do the same things. They're getting there through different means, but I would say the UK is leading the charge at the moment.
Fantastic. It's been a great conversation. I think there's still plenty more to discuss, but it's a start. Thanks so much to our panelists, to John, to Damien, to Selene, to Hugh, to Owen, and to Poppy. Thank you to our panel, to all of you guys for coming today. Thank you to Microsoft for supporting this event and making it happen. And it just leaves for me to say I hope everyone enjoys the conference and come and join us at IPR again soon. Thank you very much.